Have you ever crossed paths with someone who seemed ordinary? Just a fleeting figure passing through your life? Only to realize later they were carrying a story far bigger than you could have imagined? This is the story of Evan Walker, a quiet carpenter from a forgotten town. In Cassidy Lane, a woman who appeared to be just another drifter on a worn-out motorcycle. Two lost souls, two battered hearts, and a chance encounter that would unravel secrets, test the fragile limits of trust, and ultimately prove that true love, the kind that changes everything, is never what it seems. Stay with me as we follow their journey through heartbreak, hope, and healing. You won't want to miss a single moment of the miracle that unfolds when kindness dares to believe in second chances. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about love, redemption, and the quiet magic of human connection, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to join us for more tales that warm the heart and lift the soul. Now let's begin. He thought she was just a drifter biker, not knowing she was a billionaire searching for true love. The first breath of autumn had arrived in Hope Ridge, curling through the tall pines and whispering across the sun-baked roads. Evan Walker stood in front of his small woodworking shop, wiping the sweat from his brow with a rag, his hands rough and calloused from a day spent shaping cedar beams. The late afternoon sun slanted low, casting long golden fingers across the sleepy town, and for a moment, Evan allowed himself to simply stand still and watch the world turn. Hope Ridge was a town that time seemed to have forgotten, just the way Evan preferred it. The people here valued hard work, simple pleasures, and keeping to their own business. Evan, with his solitary ways and weathered heart, fit right in. After the accident that had taken his wife and daughter 4 years ago, Evan had given up trying to fix what had broken inside him. Instead, he built things with his hands: sturdy tables, rocking chairs, and cabinets that outlasted the storms that battered the nearby mountains. He wiped his hands one last time, pocketed the rag, and locked up for the evening. Rusty, his loyal golden retriever, trotted to his side, tail wagging. Evan gave him a pat before heading to his truck parked by the curb. That's when he noticed her. A figure hunched over a motorcycle just down the road, framed against the setting sun. At first glance, she was just another drifter. Hope Ridge was the kind of place motorcyclists passed through on their way to somewhere bigger, somewhere busier. She wore a battered leather jacket, her jeans dusty from the road, and her hair was a tangle of chestnut waves blowing freely in the breeze. She wrestled with the rear tire of her bike, cursing softly under her breath. Evan paused, his instincts at war with one another. People who looked like that usually didn't want help, and he wasn't the type to offer unless asked. He could easily climb into his truck, drive home, and forget he ever saw her. No one would fault him. It wasn't his problem. But then she kicked the tire in frustration, and for a fleeting moment, he caught a glimpse of her face. Not just the road-worn exhaustion, but something else. Loneliness. That aching, familiar brand of loneliness that no amount of asphalt miles could erase. Evan sighed. "Come on, Rusty," he muttered, setting off toward her. "Need a hand?" he called out when he was close enough. The woman looked up sharply as if she hadn't expected anyone to notice, much less care. Her eyes, startlingly bright green like fresh spring leaves, blinked against the sun. "Yeah, actually," she said, her voice carrying a rough-edged warmth. "Tire's flat, and the kit I have is, well, useless." Evan crouched down beside the bike, inspecting the damage. Rusty sniffed curiously at the scuffed leather saddlebags. "Patch kit's shredded," Evan observed, "and there's no way you're riding this thing another mile without help." She laughed on a short, rueful sound. "That's about the story of my life." Evan glanced up at her, one eyebrow raised. She offered a lopsided smile, the kind that tried to pretend it wasn't hurting. "I can tow you back to my place," Evan offered. "I've got a shop. Tools, patches, whatever you need. It's not far." The woman hesitated. In that heartbeat, Evan saw the calculation behind her eyes. A stranger in a strange town offered help by another stranger. Trust didn't come easy. Not anymore. Not for anyone who lived long enough to know better. But finally she nodded. "All right, thanks. Name's Cassidy, by the way." "Evan," he said, standing and dusting off his jeans. "Truck's over there." They worked quickly, hoisting the heavy bike onto the small trailer Evan hitched to the back of his pickup. Cassidy moved with a kind of easy, practiced strength, but there was a tiredness to her motions that spoke of long roads and longer nights. As they drove toward Evan's home, a modest cabin tucked against the tree line, Cassidy kept mostly quiet, her fingers drumming a restless beat against her knee. Evan didn't press her with questions. He had learned that silence was sometimes the kindest thing you could offer. "Nice town," Cassidy said finally, her voice almost wistful as they turned onto the winding dirt road leading to his property. "Doesn't seem like the kind of place that changes much." "It doesn't," Evan replied simply. He pulled up to the barn where he kept his woodworking tools and parked. The evening air was crisp now, carrying the faint scent of pine and wood smoke. As Evan unloaded the bike, Cassidy wandered a few steps away, gazing at the vast expanse of orange and pink bleeding across the sky. "It's beautiful here," she murmured, almost to herself. "Yeah," Evan said, securing the bike on a stand. "Not a bad place to lose yourself for a while." Cassidy turned to look at him, something unreadable flickering in her gaze. "Maybe that's exactly what I need." Evan didn't ask what she meant. He handed her a wrench and gestured to the tire. "Let's get you back on the road first," he said. "Then we'll figure out the rest." And as they worked side by side, two strangers, bound together by nothing more than a flat tire and a flicker of kindness, Evan felt, for the first time in a very long time, the quiet stirrings of something he thought he had buried for good: hope. The next morning, Evan found Cassidy sitting on the front porch, her battered leather jacket draped over her knees, a steaming mug of coffee cupped between her hands. Rusty sat faithfully at her feet, tail thumping lazily against the wooden boards every few seconds. The sight struck Evan with unexpected familiarity, as if she belonged there, as natural as the mist lifting off the treetops. He shook the thought away. Cassidy was a drifter, just passing through. Hope Ridge had seen plenty of them over the years. None stayed. "You're up early," Evan said, stepping onto the porch with a fresh cup of coffee in his own hand. Cassidy looked up and offered a smile, small but genuine. "Habit. The road doesn't exactly allow for sleeping in." Evan chuckled softly. "Suppose it doesn't." For a while they sat in companionable silence, sipping their coffee while the town slowly stirred awake beyond the trees. A breeze tugged at the hem of Cassidy's t-shirt, and Evan noticed again how slight she looked without the heavy jacket. Not fragile, but worn thin by something deeper than just miles traveled. "I appreciate the help," Cassidy said after a moment, her voice low. "Most people would have kept driving." Evan shrugged. "Most people aren't raising Rusty," he said, scratching behind the dog's ears. Cassidy laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise even herself. "Well, thank Rusty for me, too." Evan set his cup down and leaned back against one of the porch posts, studying her out of the corner of his eye. "You planning to get back on the road today?" Cassidy hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around her mug. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe not." There was a note of uncertainty in her voice that Evan didn't miss. He recognized it, the way someone sounded when they weren't sure where home was anymore, or if it even existed. "Town's not much," Evan said after a beat, "but it's got decent coffee, and Mrs. Daly's diner makes a mean blueberry pie." Cassidy smiled into her cup. "Sounds tempting." "Stay a day or two," Evan offered, surprising even himself with the invitation. "Get your bearings." He hadn't meant to say it, hadn't planned to open up his quiet life to a stranger, but the words felt right, as natural as breathing. Cassidy glanced at him, studying him with those clear green eyes, searching for something. Maybe weighing whether kindness here came with strings attached. She must have found what she needed, because she nodded. "All right," she said. "1 or 2 days, tops." By noon, Cassidy had settled into the rhythm of Hope Ridge, like she'd been there for years. She wandered through town, chatting easily with shop owners, laughing with the kids riding their bikes past the general store. Evan watched from a distance, leaning against the doorway of his workshop, arms crossed over his chest. It was strange, he thought, how easily she slipped into this place, how naturally she fit, like a missing piece no one had known was missing. Later that afternoon, Evan found her in his workshop, crouched beside one of his half-finished rocking chairs, running her fingers along the smooth, sanded armrest. "You build all this?" she asked, glancing up at him. "Yeah," Evan said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Keeps me out of trouble." Cassidy laughed again, that low musical sound that was quickly becoming familiar. "You're good," she said simply. "Really good." Evan ducked his head, feeling strangely pleased by the compliment. "Thanks." She rose, brushing sawdust from her jeans, and wandered through the rows of finished pieces, tables, chairs, benches, each one crafted with a quiet kind of care that few people these days bothered to notice. "You ever sell these?" she asked. "Some," Evan admitted. "Mostly to folks around here. Not much call for handmade stuff anymore." Cassidy traced the curve of a cherrywood table, her expression thoughtful. "There should be," she said. "People don't realize what they're losing." For a moment, Evan saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a grief not unlike his own, a mourning not just for people, but for a way of life slowly fading away. "You sound like someone who's lost more than a flat tire," Evan said quietly. Cassidy's hand paused on the table. She didn't look at him, but her voice was steady when she answered. "Maybe I have." Before Evan could ask more, the sound of a motorcycle engine roared down the main street. Both of them turned instinctively toward the noise. A sleek black Harley pulled up in front of the diner, and a man in a designer leather jacket dismounted with practiced ease. Cassidy stiffened. Evan didn't miss it. The way her shoulders tightened, the way her fingers curled into fists at her sides. "You know him?" he asked carefully. Cassidy's jaw worked silently for a moment before she nodded. "Yeah," she said, voice clipped. "I know him." The man spotted Cassidy almost immediately. His smile was cold, predatory. Evan stepped forward instinctively, positioning himself slightly in front of her, without thinking. "You want to tell me what's going on?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Cassidy shook her head, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's nothing," she said. "Just someone from the past." But Evan knew, just as surely as he knew the grain of good oak, that this wasn't nothing. Whatever had brought Cassidy Lane to Hope Ridge, whatever she was running from, had just roared into town on a Harley. And somehow, Evan knew he was standing at the edge of something bigger than he could yet understand. Something that was about to change everything. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows of Evan's workshop, casting long beams of golden light across the dust-laden air. The scent of freshly cut pine hung thick, earthy and comforting. Evan was bent over a slab of oak, smoothing its surface with slow, deliberate strokes, when Cassidy wandered in again. She leaned casually against the doorframe, arms crossed, a bemused smile playing on her lips. Rusty, ever the welcoming committee, patted over and nudged her hand until she scratched behind his ears. "You always smell like sawdust," Cassidy teased lightly. Evan glanced up, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Better than smelling like diesel and road dust," he said, nodding toward the scuffed boots and worn jeans she still wore. Cassidy chuckled, stepping further inside. She moved with an easy grace, her fingers trailing lightly over the finished pieces lined against the wall. A row of rocking chairs, a sturdy farmhouse table, a hand-carved crib that had never been claimed. "You're good at this," she said, her tone almost reverent. "It's like every piece has a story." Evan shrugged, setting down his planer. "Wood's honest. You put in the work, you get something solid in return. Doesn't lie to you. Doesn't leave." There was a weight to his words he hadn't intended, and for a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. Cassidy didn't press. She simply wandered closer to the workbench, picking up a small carving knife and turning it thoughtfully in her hands. "Teach me," she said suddenly. Evan blinked. "Teach you what?" "How to make something," she said, her voice earnest. "Something that lasts." Evan studied her for a long moment. Cassidy was a woman of contradictions. Rugged yet refined, guarded yet strangely open. Whatever road she had traveled to get here had left its mark on her, same as it had on him. "All right," he said finally, gesturing to the scrap pile in the corner. "Pick a piece, something small to start." Cassidy grinned and trotted over, sifting through the pile until she found a block of cedar about the size of a paperback. She brought it back like a prize. Evan set up a stool beside his workbench, handing her a piece of chalk. "First rule," he said, "know what you're making before you start cutting." Cassidy tapped the chalk against her lip, thinking, "How about a little bird? Something simple." Evan smiled despite himself. Bird it is. He showed her how to sketch the rough outline, how to steady her hand, how to carve with the grain rather than against it. Cassidy listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. The first few strokes were clumsy, uneven, but she didn't curse or throw the knife down like some did. She simply kept trying. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the air between them grew easier, lighter. They talked in low voices, sharing pieces of themselves without even realizing it. Cassidy told him about the places she'd seen, the dusty roads of Arizona, the endless cornfields of Iowa, the sunrises over the Blue Ridge Mountains. She spoke of them with a kind of wistful longing, as if each place had left a piece of itself stitched into her soul. Evan found himself talking too, more than he had in years, about growing up here in Hope Ridge, about his father's old workshop where he learned to carve his first toy boat, about how he had fallen in love young and hard, about the little girl with curly hair who used to dance in the rain while he worked on the porch. Cassidy listened without interrupting, her eyes soft and unjudging. When he faltered, she didn't push. She simply waited, giving him the space to find his words. "You loved them a lot," she said quietly when he finished. "Still do," Evan murmured, smoothing the edge of the bird she was carving. The sun dipped lower, painting the walls in deeper shades of amber and crimson. Cassidy held up her little wooden bird, rough-edged, a little lopsided, but unmistakably full of heart. "It's not perfect," she said, laughing at herself. Evan took it gently, examining the work. "Neither's life," he said, "but you did good." Their hands brushed as he handed it back to her, a fleeting touch that sparked a strange, welcome warmth through Evan's chest. Cassidy's smile faltered for just a second, replaced by something more vulnerable, more real. "Thanks," she said, her voice almost a whisper. They stood there a moment longer than necessary, two souls battered by different storms, finding, without saying a word, the tentative beginning of shelter in each other. The spell broke when Rusty barked excitedly, chasing a squirrel across the yard. Cassidy laughed and tucked the bird carefully into her jacket pocket. "I think I'll stick around for that pie you promised," she said, heading toward the door. Evan watched her go, the evening breeze tugging at her hair, the horizon behind her bleeding into 1,000 colors. For the first time in a long time, Evan didn't mind the idea of change. Maybe, just maybe, some strangers weren't meant to pass through. Maybe some were meant to stay. The next morning broke clear and cool, the autumn air crisp enough to bite the skin. Evan was already in his workshop, whistling low under his breath as he set up a new project. Repairing an old kitchen table he'd promised Mrs. Daly from the diner down the street. The table was a relic, heavy oak, worn soft by decades of family meals, scratched by the laughter of children, scarred by the sharp corners of life. Evan ran his hand along the gouged surface with a kind of reverence. Some things were worth saving, no matter how battered they looked. Cassidy appeared in the doorway just as he was setting clamps into place. She held 2 steaming mugs of coffee, the sleeves of her sweatshirt pushed up over her forearms. "I come bearing gifts," she announced, crossing the room. "You're already learning," Evan teased, accepting the mug with a nod of thanks. "Coffee's the price of admission around here." Cassidy grinned and perched herself on a stool, watching curiously as he worked. "What's the story with that one?" she asked, nodding at the battered table. Evan glanced up, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Mrs. Daly says it's been in her family for 3 generations. Seen birthday cakes, Sunday suppers, and more than a few holiday arguments." Cassidy's smile softened. "Sounds like it's lived a full life." Evan set his tools down, wiping his hands on a rag. "It has. Most people would toss something like this out these days. Buy a new one. But Mrs. Daly, she said it's not about what it looks like. It's about what it holds." Cassidy nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "Memories." "Yeah," Evan said. "Memories." There was a pause, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable, just full. Evan picked up a sanding block and began working the tabletop, and after a moment, Cassidy moved to his side. "Show me," she asked almost shyly. Evan handed her a smaller block, demonstrating how to move with the grain, not against it. Cassidy caught on quickly, her strokes tentative at first, then more confident as the surface began to smooth under her hands. You ever think about making new memories? Cassidy asked quietly as they worked side by side. Evan paused, considering. Sometimes, he admitted, but it's easier to fix broken things than broken hearts. Cassidy didn't answer right away. She just kept sanding, her face thoughtful. Maybe fixing broken things helps fix the heart too, she said finally. Her words struck deeper than Evan expected. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the truth there, reflected in the set of her jaw, the quiet determination in her eyes. She wasn't just talking about him. She was talking about herself too. They sanded in silence for a while, the rhythmic rasp of the blocks filling the room. Outside, the trees rustled in the breeze, their leaves a thousand shades of fire and gold. You know, Cassidy said after a while, brushing sawdust from her jeans, I used to think moving on meant leaving everything behind. Starting over. Clean slate. And now? Evan asked. Cassidy shrugged, a wistful smile touching her lips. Now I think maybe moving on means carrying some things with you. The good stuff. The stuff that matters. Evan nodded slowly. Sounds about right. For the first time, Evan realized how comfortable he felt around her. It wasn't just the easy banter or the shared silences. It was the way Cassidy understood things without him needing to explain them. The way she didn't try to fix him, or pity him, or pretend his pain wasn't there. She simply stayed. Tell you what, Evan said, setting down his sanding block. You help me finish this table, I'll teach you how to build one of your own. Cassidy's eyes lit up, a spark of something pure and unguarded flashing across her face. Deal. They worked until the sun slanted low through the windows, staining the workshop in molten gold. The table's surface gleamed under their hands, each scratch and dent lovingly preserved beneath a fresh coat of polish, not erased but honored, part of its story. When they finally stepped back to admire their work, Cassidy looked at Evan, her smile easy and genuine. I think we did good, she said. We did, Evan agreed. But he wasn't just talking about the table. Something unspoken had shifted between them, something that felt as solid and enduring as the oak beneath their fingertips. A quiet trust, a fragile hope. Cassidy tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her expression suddenly serious. Thanks for letting me stay a little longer, she said. Evan met her gaze, steady and sure. Stay as long as you need? Outside, the wind picked up, scattering leaves across the yard in a swirling dance. Evan watched them drift, feeling for the first time in a long while like maybe he wasn't drifting anymore either. Maybe, just maybe, he was finding his way home. The trail into the hills behind Evan's cabin was an old logging path, mostly forgotten, overgrown in places with wild blackberry brambles and tall grasses. It was the kind of place only locals knew, the kind that led to nowhere in particular, which was precisely what made it perfect. Evan and Cassidy set out just after lunch, Rusty bounding ahead with reckless enthusiasm, nose to the ground, tail a golden flag against the sky. Cassidy wore a faded flannel shirt over her t-shirt, her hair pulled back loosely, strands escaping to frame her face. They walked side by side without speaking at first, their boots crunching over dry leaves, the wind whispering secrets through the trees. Evan carried a small backpack slung over one shoulder, packed with 2 canteens of water and a couple of Mrs. Daly's famous sandwiches. Where exactly are we going? Cassidy asked, shading her eyes against the sun. You'll see, Evan said, a small smile tugging at his mouth. The path wound higher, offering glimpses of the town below, the patchwork quilt of fields, the thin silver ribbon of the river snaking through the valley. Cassidy paused once or twice, turning in slow circles to take it all in, like she was trying to memorize every detail. You grew up here, huh? She asked as they climbed a steeper incline. Born and raised, Evan said. Same as my dad. Same as his. Cassidy glanced at him sideways. You ever wanted to leave? Evan considered the question. When I was young, sure. Thought I'd see the world. Then life had other plans. Cassidy nodded as if she understood all too well. Life's good at that. At the crest of the hill, the trees opened up to reveal a small clearing where an ancient oak stood, its gnarled branches stretching wide like welcoming arms. A rough-hewn bench sat beneath it, weathered but sturdy, overlooking the endless sweep of mountains beyond. Evan dropped the backpack at the base of the tree and sat down heavily on the bench. Cassidy joined him, tucking her legs up beneath her like a child. For a while, they simply sat there, sharing the quiet. "You ever think," Cassidy said softly, "that maybe we're all just waiting for something?" Evan turned his head, studying her profile, the stubborn tilt of her chin, the vulnerability she couldn't quite hide. "Waiting for what?" he asked. Cassidy shrugged, her gaze distant. "A reason. A sign. Someone." Evan let the question hang between them, carried away by the breeze. "I used to think," he said after a moment, "that if you love someone enough, you could hold them safe. Keep the bad things out." Cassidy looked at him then, really looked, and something in her face softened. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evan swallowed, feeling the old familiar ache tighten in his chest. He wasn't a man who talked about feelings easily. Years of grief had taught him to lock those doors tight, but Cassidy's presence, the steady patience in her eyes, made it feel possible. "My wife, Lena," he began, the words rough and slow, "and our little girl, Emily. They were driving into town one winter afternoon. Black ice on the road. Lost control. There was nothing anyone could have done." Cassidy's hand moved instinctively, resting lightly on his forearm. She didn't speak, didn't offer hollow platitudes. She simply stayed. "I blame myself for a long time," Evan admitted. "Still do some days. Thought maybe if I'd been with them, if I'd fixed the tires the day before, if I'd—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Cassidy squeezed his arm gently. "I'm sorry, Evan." He let out a shaky breath, feeling something inside him loosen, not breaking, but bending, flexing under the weight he had carried alone for too long. "I stopped letting people in after that," he said. "Figured it was safer that way. No attachments, no losses." Cassidy was quiet for a long time. Then she said, so softly he almost missed it, "I get it." Evan turned toward her, surprised by the rawness in her voice. "I trusted someone once," she said, picking at a frayed thread on her sleeve. "Gave them everything I had. Thought they loved me for who I was, not for what I had." Evan didn't push, but his silence was invitation enough. "My family—" Cassidy hesitated, the words clearly hard to force out. "They're well-known, wealthy, more than most people can imagine. I tried to keep that part of me hidden, wanted someone to see me, not the money." She laughed, a brittle sound. "Turns out, people have a way of finding out. And when they do," she shook her head, "it changes things. It always changes things." Evan's heart twisted. He saw her now, not as the mysterious biker who'd blown into town, but as a woman who had been used, betrayed, and left to wonder if anyone could love her without conditions. "That's why you're drifting," he said. Cassidy nodded. "Looking for somewhere to belong, someone who doesn't care about all the rest." Their eyes met, a current passing between them, too strong to name. They sat there under the old oak tree, two people battered by different storms, finding, for the first time, that their broken pieces fit together. Rusty barked in the distance, chasing a rabbit through the underbrush, and the spell between them lightened. "Come on," Evan said, standing and offering Cassidy his hand. "Let's eat before Rusty steals the sandwiches." Cassidy laughed, a real, unguarded laugh, and took his hand without hesitation. As they unpacked their lunch and watched the sun slip lower behind the mountains, Evan realized something he hadn't dared believe in a long time. Maybe walls weren't meant to keep people out. Maybe they were just waiting for the right person to tear them down. Hope Ridge's annual Golden Leaf Festival had always been Evan's favorite time of year. Not for the games or the contests, but for the way the whole town seemed to pause and celebrate something as fleeting as the turning of the leaves. By mid-afternoon, Main Street was alive with color. Stalls lined the sidewalks, selling everything from homemade fudge to hand-knitted scarves. The air smelled of cinnamon, roasted corn, and crisp mountain apples. Laughter floated through the chilly breeze as children darted between booths, their pockets stuffed with candy and prize tickets. Evan found himself walking alongside Cassidy through the festive chaos, a cup of hot cider warming his hands. She wore a simple navy sweater and a pair of faded jeans, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked content, maybe even happy. It suited her. Is it always like this? Cassidy asked, surveying the pumpkin pie contest underway at the town square. Pretty much, Evan said. We take our leaves seriously around here. Cassidy laughed, the sound light and easy. I can see that. They wandered past the booths, stopping to admire homemade quilts and hand-carved toys. Every few minutes, someone would call out to Evan. An old neighbor, a former classmate, someone whose chair or table now sat proudly in their kitchen. Cassidy watched with a soft smile as Evan greeted each one with quiet humility. She saw how easily he fit here, how deeply he was woven into the fabric of this place, and for the first time in a long while, Cassidy felt a flicker of longing, not for adventure or escape, but for something steady, something real. As they passed the bandstand where a bluegrass group was tuning up, a young girl with curly red hair darted in front of them, clutching a handful of tickets. Come on, Mr. Walker, she called, laughing. You have to try the sack race. You always win. Evan chuckled and shook his head. I think my winning days are behind me, Maisie. Please, the girl begged, batting her lashes dramatically. Cassidy leaned in, grinning. How can you say no to that face? Evan gave her a mock glare, then sighed in defeat. All right, but only if I get a head start. Maisie whooped and ran off to sign him up. Cassidy folded her arms, looking far too pleased with herself. This, I have to see. Minutes later, Evan found himself lined up with a dozen others at the start of the sack race, his feet stuffed awkwardly into a burlap sack. Cassidy stood at the sidelines, laughing openly, her hands cupped around her mouth as she shouted encouragement. Come on, Walker! Show them how it's done! The whistle blew and Evan lurched forward, hopping and stumbling like a man twice his age. The crowd roared with laughter and cheers. He wasn't the fastest, but somehow he wasn't the worst either. When he finally collapsed across the finish line, he was breathless and grinning like a fool. Cassidy rushed over, offering him a hand up. You, she said between fits of laughter, are my new hero. Evan shook his head, still catching his breath. Remind me to never listen to you again. They wandered back toward the food stands, Evan still limping slightly, Cassidy wiping tears of laughter from her eyes. As the sun dipped lower, string lights blinked to life across the square, casting a warm, golden glow over the festivities. A slow song drifted from the bandstand, and couples began to pair off, swaying gently beneath the lanterns. Cassidy stood at the edge of the square, watching them with a wistful smile. You dance? Evan asked, stepping up beside her. Cassidy hesitated. It's been a long time. Evan offered his hand without a word. For a moment, Cassidy simply stared at it, as if weighing something heavier than just a dance. Then slowly, she placed her hand in his. Evan led her into the center of the square, the crowd parting to let them through. The music was soft, a simple waltz carried on the autumn air. Evan rested one hand lightly at Cassidy's waist, feeling the slight tremble beneath her steady exterior. Cassidy's hand settled on his shoulder, and they began to sway. At first it was awkward, two people unused to this kind of closeness, fumbling for rhythm. But as the minutes passed, they found it, found each other. The world around them blurred, the laughter, the music, the twinkling lights, until there was only the steady beat of the music and the quiet connection growing between them. Evan looked down at Cassidy, at the way the lamplight softened the lines of her face, and something inside him shifted. A realization, as startling as it was simple. He wanted her to stay, not just for a day or two, not just until the leaves finished falling. He wanted her to stay for all the seasons to come. Cassidy met his gaze and he saw the same thing mirrored in her eyes. The fear, the hope, the fragile beginnings of something neither of them dared name yet. When the song ended, they didn't move away right away. They simply stood there, still holding each other, as the world carried on around them. It wasn't a grand moment. No declarations, no fireworks, just two broken souls finding, in each other, a place to belong. And sometimes, Evan thought as he brushed a stray strand of hair from Cassidy's face, that was more miraculous than anything else. The morning after the festival dawned gray and heavy with mist. Evan stood on his porch, a mug of coffee cradled between his hands, watching as tendrils of fog curled through the trees like cautious fingers. Rusty sat by his side, tail thumping a slow rhythm against the floorboards. The house behind him was silent, Cassidy still asleep in the spare room, no doubt worn out from the previous night's festivities. Evan smiled to himself, remembering how Cassidy had laughed during the sack race, how she had leaned into him during their slow dance under the golden lights. He hadn't felt this light, this hopeful, in years. But hope, Evan knew, was a fragile thing. A truck pulled into the driveway. Unfamiliar, sleek, too polished for a town like Hope Ridge. Evan stiffened as the door swung open, and a man stepped out, smoothing the sleeves of his expensive leather jacket. The stranger looked around with an air of practiced entitlement before his eyes landed on Evan. "You must be Evan Walker," he said, his voice smooth, almost oily. Evan nodded slowly. "Who's asking?" The man smiled, a sharp, cold thing. "Name's Graham. I'm here for Cassidy." At the sound of her name, a knot tightened in Evan's gut. Graham leaned casually against his truck. "She's been hard to track down. You wouldn't believe how many small towns there are between here and nowhere." Evan said nothing, just watched him. Graham chuckled. "Relax. I'm not here to cause trouble, just to remind Cassidy of who she is and what she's supposed to be doing." There was something in his tone that set Evan's teeth on edge. Before he could reply, Cassidy stepped out onto the porch, barefoot, wearing one of Evan's old flannel shirts over her jeans. She froze when she saw Graham, all the color draining from her face. "Hello, Cass," Graham said, straightening. "Long time." Cassidy's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What are you doing here?" "You didn't exactly leave a forwarding address," Graham said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Your father's been worried sick. The board's been losing their minds. You can't just walk away from all of it." Evan's gaze darted between them, pieces falling into place. The expensive jacket, the polished truck, the way Cassidy's shoulders had gone rigid. She wasn't just someone from a wealthy family. She was someone important, someone who hadn't told him the truth. "I told you," Cassidy said tightly. "I'm done with that life." "You don't get to be done," Graham said. "Not when there's a fortune tied to your name. Not when your family's reputation is on the line." Cassidy stepped down off the porch, planting herself between Evan and Graham. "I'm not coming back," she said firmly. "Not now. Maybe not ever." Graham's smile faltered. For the first time, a crack appeared in his polished veneer. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Cassidy didn't flinch. "It's mine to make." Graham looked past her, directly at Evan. "Be careful, Mr. Walker. She's not who you think she is." With that, he climbed back into his truck and roared off, a trail of dust kicking up behind him. Silence settled heavily over the porch. Rusty whined softly, sensing the tension. Cassidy turned slowly, meeting Evan's gaze. Her face was pale, her eyes wounded but defiant. "I was going to tell you," she said, her voice cracking. Evan set his coffee down carefully, feeling as though the ground beneath him had shifted. "Tell me what exactly?" he asked, keeping his voice even. Cassidy wrapped her arms around herself. "My family, they're Harringtons, Harrington Motors. My father runs it, or did, before the board started pushing him out. I'm, technically, I guess, the heir." She laughed bitterly. "A billionaire drifter. Pretty ironic, huh?" Evan ran a hand through his hair, trying to process. He wasn't angry, not yet, but confusion tangled with something heavier in his chest. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked. Cassidy's shoulders sagged. "Because it changes everything. People look at you differently. They treat you differently. They stop seeing you." She stepped closer, desperation flickering across her face. "I didn't want you to see her," she said, her voice breaking. "I wanted you to see me." Evan stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He thought about the nights they had spent talking in the workshop, about the way she had looked at the old table they restored together, about the way she had laughed, unguarded, real, at the festival. Had that been Cassidy Lane Harrington, or just Cassidy? And did it matter? Part of him wanted to say no. Part of him wanted to reach for her, to erase the hurt from her eyes. But another part, the part that remembered how it felt to trust and lose everything, hesitated. "I need some time," he said finally, his voice rough. Cassidy nodded, blinking back tears. "I understand." She turned and walked slowly back into the house, leaving Evan standing alone on the porch, the mist closing in around him. Rusty nudged his hand, whining softly. Evan stared out into the fog, feeling the walls he had started to tear down rebuild themselves, brick by painful brick. Trust, he realized, wasn't something easily given, or easily rebuilt, especially not when the past was still casting such long shadows. Hope Ridge's annual Fall Charity Gala was the kind of event where everybody dressed up a little too much, the food was a little too sweet, and the gossip flowed freer than the spiked cider. Evan hadn't planned to attend this year. After the confrontation with Graham, after the heavy silence that had filled his house for the past 2 days, the last thing he wanted was to plaster on a polite smile and pretend everything was fine. But Mrs. Daly had cornered him outside the diner that morning, pressing a ticket into his hand with a look that brooked no argument. "You can't hold yourself up forever, Evan Walker," she had said, wagging a finger at him. "Sometimes you gotta show up, especially when it's hard." And so, against his better judgment, Evan found himself standing near the back of the town hall, nursing a cup of lukewarm punch, trying not to scowl at the string lights and cheerful decorations. Cassidy was there too. She stood across the room, near the silent auction tables, her hair pulled back into a simple twist, wearing a dress the color of autumn leaves. She looked beautiful and out of place, as if a part of her didn't quite belong here, or anywhere. Their eyes met briefly, but neither of them moved. Evan turned away, his heart a confused knot of emotions he couldn't yet untangle. The mayor tapped the microphone at the front of the hall, calling for attention. "All right, folks," he boomed. "Before we kick off the final round of auctions, I want to thank all the generous donors who made tonight possible, including a very special guest, someone whose name you might recognize." Evan frowned, a low murmur rippling through the crowd. The mayor beamed. "Please join me in welcoming Miss Cassidy Lane Harrington, heir to the Harrington Motors fortune, who has graciously pledged a significant donation to our town's rebuilding fund." Applause erupted, loud and enthusiastic. Heads swiveled toward Cassidy, who stood frozen in place, her cheeks flushing scarlet. Evan's stomach dropped. Not just because the secret was out, but because of the way people looked at her now. Not with kindness, not with understanding, with calculation. He saw the way Mrs. Jenkins from the town council straightened her spine, the way Mr. Warner from the hardware store elbowed his wife and whispered behind his hand. He saw how smiles grew a little too wide, how voices turned a little too eager. Cassidy forced a polite smile, nodding stiffly as she accepted the sudden wave of attention. But Evan saw the flicker of fear behind her eyes, the sadness, the confirmation of everything she had been running from. He didn't realize he was moving until he was halfway across the room. "Evan," Cassidy started when he reached her, but he shook his head. "Not here," he said quietly. They slipped out a side door into the cool night, the noise of the gala fading behind them. The parking lot was mostly empty, bathed in pale yellow light from the overhead lamps. Cassidy wrapped her arms around herself, her shoulders tight with tension. "You weren't supposed to find out like that," she said, her voice raw. Evan leaned against the hood of his truck, staring at the cracked asphalt. "You mean," he said slowly, "you weren't going to tell me at all?" Cassidy flinched. "I was. I wanted to be sure first that you saw me. Not the money, not the name." "And you didn't think," Evan said, bitterness creeping into his voice, "that trusting me with the truth might be part of that?" Cassidy closed her eyes as if bracing for a blow. "I've spent my whole life being a Harrington," she said, her voice shaking. "Everything I did, every person I met, it was always about the name, the company, the expectations. I needed to be someone else for once, even if it was just for a little while." Evan looked at her, really looked, and saw the anguish there, the loneliness, the desperation. He wanted to reach for her, to tell her it was okay, but he couldn't quite cross the distance, because somewhere deep down, the old fear still clung to him, the fear that nothing real ever lasted, that letting someone in meant handing them the power to leave. "I understand why you did it," Evan said finally. "I do." Cassidy opened her mouth to respond, hope flickering across her face. "But," he continued, "understanding it doesn't mean it doesn't hurt." Cassidy's shoulders sagged. "I never wanted to lie to you," she whispered. Evan nodded stiffly. "Maybe not, but you did." They stood there in the brittle silence, two people who had come so close to something rare, something precious, only to watch it slip through their fingers. "I think," Evan said, his throat tight, "you need to figure out who you are. Not who you want to be, not who people expect you to be. Just you." Cassidy blinked back tears, her chin trembling. "And maybe," Evan added, "I need to figure that out for myself too." Neither of them moved. Neither of them said goodbye. But when Cassidy finally turned and walked away, her boots crunching softly over the gravel, Evan felt it all the same. The loss, the ache of something unfinished, the fragile hope that maybe, someday, they would find their way back to each other, stronger, truer, and ready. But tonight was not that night. Not yet. Winter came to Hope Ridge quietly that year, like a slow, reluctant exhale. The first snow dusted the fields and rooftops in a thin blanket of white, softening the sharp edges of the world. The river froze along its banks. The trees stood bare against a sky the color of pewter. Inside Evan's cabin, the fire crackled low in the hearth. He sat at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands, staring at nothing. The days had folded into one another since Cassidy left. Mornings blurred into afternoons, afternoons into endless evenings. Rusty, ever loyal, remained close, resting his head on Evan's foot, offering silent companionship. The workshop, once filled with the comforting sounds of sanding and carving, stood mostly quiet now. Evan tried. He tried to lose himself in the work, in the clean lines of oak and pine. But somehow everything he built felt hollow, unfinished. Cassidy's absence echoed louder than any sound. He would catch himself reaching for the second coffee mug in the morning, listening for her light laughter drifting down the hall, expecting somehow to see her leaning against the doorframe with that small half-smile she wore when she was trying not to get caught watching him. But she wasn't there, and every time Evan remembered that truth, it carved a little deeper into him. One night, a few days before Christmas, Evan found himself standing in his workshop, staring at the small wooden bird Cassidy had carved. Rough-edged, imperfect, beautiful in its earnestness. He picked it up, running his thumb over the uneven surface. "You did good," he had told her, and she had smiled. That rare, luminous smile he hadn't been able to forget. Setting the bird carefully back on the shelf, Evan turned and sank onto the old workbench. His chest felt too tight, his hands too empty. For a long time, he simply sat there, letting the silence fill the room like water, seeping into every crack. When had he started to believe he could have more than this quiet, solitary life? When had he let himself hope? Maybe it had been the way Cassidy listened without judgment, the way she saw past the scars he had hidden even from himself, the way she had made him want to build something more permanent than furniture, a future, and he had pushed her away. Because it was easier to rebuild walls than to risk them falling again. Evan bowed his head into his hands, the weight of it all finally breaking through the numbness. He wasn't angry at Cassidy, not truly. She had only wanted to be seen. The same thing he had wanted all these years, though he hadn't had the words for it. She had trusted him with her real self, messy, scared, uncertain, and he had hesitated. He had failed her, failed them both. The next morning, Evan took Rusty for a long walk through the snow-laden trails behind the cabin. The world was hushed under a sky of pale silver, every breath a puff of white in the freezing air. As he walked, his mind churned. What was he so afraid of? Loss? He had survived it once, barely, but he had survived. Betrayal? Cassidy had lied, yes, but not to hurt him. She had lied because she was scared, because she wanted, needed, to be loved for something more than the Harrington name. And hadn't he done the same thing? Hiding his heart behind work and routine, pretending he didn't need anyone? Maybe love wasn't about finding someone perfect. Maybe it was about finding someone willing to stay, even when it got messy, even when it hurt. When Evan returned home, he stood on the porch, staring out over the snow-blanketed yard. The wind stirred the branches overhead, shaking loose a few stubborn leaves that spiraled lazily to the ground. He thought about Cassidy, about the way she had looked at him under the old oak tree, about the way her hand had fit so naturally in his during that clumsy first dance. She hadn't just fit into his life, she had made it brighter, fuller, alive. And he missed her. God, he missed her. Not the idea of her, not the wealthy heiress or the mysterious drifter, but her. The woman who had stood in his kitchen barefoot, who had laughed at his awful sack race, who had believed in the worth of an old, battered table. Evan exhaled, his breath a cloud in the frigid air. He had been given a second chance. Not everyone got one. He wasn't going to waste it, not this time. Inside, he dug out a piece of paper and a pen, sitting at the same kitchen table where Cassidy had once teased him for drinking too much coffee. At first, the words came slowly, haltingly. Then, like a thawing river, they began to flow. He wrote about the way she had changed him without even trying, about the ways he had failed her, and the ways he wanted, needed to do better. He wrote not to erase the hurt, but to honor it, to show her that even broken things could be made whole again. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully, slipped it into an envelope, and stared at it for a long moment. Tomorrow he would find her. Tomorrow he would fight for what he should have fought for all along. Tonight he would let hope settle quietly into the cracks she had left behind. Not to erase the pain, but to remind him that love, real love, was worth every scar. And in the silent hush of a Hope Ridge winter, Evan Walker dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, the best parts of his story were still waiting to be written. The day Evan Walker decided to leave Hope Ridge, the world was caught between winter's last breath and the early whisper of spring. Snow clung stubbornly to the shadows, but patches of wet earth and shy green shoots peeked through the thawing ground. He loaded the old Chevy truck carefully, packing only the essentials: a change of clothes, a worn photo of Lena and Emily tucked into his wallet, and the letter he had written to Cassidy, folded and refolded until the creases felt permanent. Rusty jumped eagerly into the passenger seat, tail wagging, sensing the shift in Evan's usual routine. "This is it, boy," Evan said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "No more waiting." He didn't have a real plan, just a name, a distant memory of a conversation about a small town near the city where Cassidy once mentioned volunteering at a community shelter. It wasn't much, but sometimes, Evan thought, you didn't need a map. Sometimes you just needed faith. The drive out of Hope Ridge was harder than Evan expected. He had spent his whole life here, weaving himself into its quiet rhythms, its stubborn silences. For years it had been enough. Safe. But safe hadn't made him happy. Safe hadn't brought him Cassidy. As the mountains faded behind him, Evan tightened his grip on the wheel, feeling both fear and excitement twist together in his chest. He was leaving the only home he had ever known to find someone who might not even want to be found. But he had to try. For the first time in a long time, Evan wasn't running from something. He was running toward it. The city hit him like a slap. The noise, the crowds, the impatient rhythm of life moving at twice the speed he was used to. Rusty pressed close to his side as they navigated the unfamiliar streets. Evan asked around, at gas stations, diners, even the public library, using Cassidy's name cautiously, unsure how much he should say. Most people shook their heads, apologizing. At the end of the second day, he found himself sitting in the cab of his truck, parked outside a nondescript brick building with a faded sign, Willow Creek Community Center. Inside, the lights burned warm and steady against the gathering dusk. Evan sat there for a long moment, heart hammering. What if she wasn't here? What if she didn't want to see him? He thought about turning around, about going back to the safe, known life waiting for him in Hope Ridge. But then he thought about Cassidy, about her laughter, her stubbornness, her kindness, and he knew he couldn't turn back. Not now, not ever. Squaring his shoulders, Evan climbed out of the truck. The receptionist inside the community center looked up with a polite smile. "Can I help you, sir?" Evan cleared his throat. "I'm looking for someone. Cassidy Lane." The woman's smile widened. "You must be from Hope Ridge." Evan blinked. "How'd you know?" "She talks about it sometimes," the woman said warmly. "Says it's the only place that ever felt like home." Something inside Evan cracked open at those words. "Is she here?" he asked, barely daring to breathe. The woman nodded toward a hallway. "Down the hall, second door on the left. She's helping set up for the literacy program tonight. Evan mumbled his thanks and made his way down the corridor, his boots loud against the worn linoleum. He paused outside the door, heart in his throat. Through the small window he saw her, kneeling by a table, arranging books into neat piles, a smudge of ink on her cheek, her hair tied up messily. She wore jeans and a simple sweater. No makeup, no pretense. Just Cassidy, just herself. Evan pushed open the door. Cassidy looked up, startled. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then her eyes widened, disbelief flooding her face. "Evan," she whispered, as if afraid saying it out loud would make him disappear. He stepped forward, pulling the folded letter from his pocket, his hands shaking slightly. "I thought," he said hoarsely, "that maybe we could start over, if you'll let me." Cassidy rose slowly, her movements hesitant, uncertain. "You came all this way," she said, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "I'd have gone farther," Evan said simply. "I would have gone anywhere." Tears welled in Cassidy's eyes, but she smiled, that real beautiful smile he remembered, and crossed the distance between them. "You didn't have to," she whispered. "Yeah," Evan said, voice thick. "I did." He held out the letter awkwardly, but Cassidy shook her head, reaching instead for his hand. "I don't need a letter," she said. "I just need you." And just like that, the weight Evan had been carrying for so long slipped away, leaving only the steady, certain beat of his heart. He pulled her into his arms, feeling her fit there, as if she had been missing all along. Rusty barked from the doorway, tail wagging furiously. Cassidy laughed through her tears, and Evan laughed too, the sound rusty from disuse but no less real. They stood there tangled together among the tables and battered books, while the world outside spun on, faster than either of them could follow. It didn't matter. They had found each other. And for Evan, that was enough. More than enough. The following days unfolded like a quiet miracle. Evan and Cassidy moved carefully around each other at first, like dancers learning a new rhythm. Tentative, unsure, but willing. The city still buzzed around them, fast and loud, but inside the small world they created. Walks in the park, late-night conversations over takeout. Rusty sprawled at their feet. Everything slowed to something tender, something real. One evening, Evan found himself sitting across from Cassidy at a rickety table inside a little diner tucked between a laundromat and a pharmacy. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the coffee tasted vaguely of burnt toast, and the cracked vinyl booth squeaked every time they shifted. It was perfect. Cassidy stirred her tea absent-mindedly, watching the spoon swirl. "You know," she said, smiling faintly, "there was a time I thought money could solve everything." Evan leaned back, arms folded loosely across his chest. "And now?" Cassidy set the spoon down carefully. "Now I know it can't fix the things that really matter. It can't buy forgiveness, or peace, or..." She looked up, her green eyes steady on his. "Love." Evan's chest tightened. He thought about all the things money could buy. Houses, cars, endless security. But none of those things could have built what was growing quietly between them now. "You ever miss it?" he asked gently. Cassidy considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "The comfort, the certainty, knowing you could always control the outcome if you threw enough resources at a problem." She smiled sadly. "But it's a lonely kind of certainty, because deep down, you know it's not real." Evan nodded slowly, understanding more than he could say. "Real doesn't come easy," he said. "You have to fight for it." Cassidy reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "I want real," she said simply. Evan covered her hand with his, the roughness of his skin against the softness of hers, a fitting metaphor for everything they had been through. "I want it too," he said. They sat there for a long time, the noise of the diner fading into the background. Two souls battered and bruised, but finally willing to believe in the possibility of healing. A few days later, Evan took Cassidy to a small park on the edge of town, a patch of green squeezed between concrete and glass. Rusty bounded ahead, chasing pigeons with joyful abandon. Cassidy laughed, her cheeks flushed from the brisk wind. Evan watched her, his heart aching with a kind of fierce, protective tenderness he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "You ever think about going back?" he asked as they strolled along the cracked sidewalk, hands brushing occasionally. Cassidy shook her head. Back to what? A boardroom full of people who see me as a name on a checkbook? A life where every smile comes with a price tag? She turned to him, serious now. I don't want that life anymore, Evan. I want this. Small, honest, messy maybe, but real. Evan stopped walking, searching her face for any trace of hesitation. He didn't find it. And in that moment, under a sky streaked with the colors of late winter, he knew what he had to do. Wait here, he said suddenly, pressing a quick kiss to her forehead before jogging back toward the truck. Cassidy watched him go, bemused. Minutes later, Evan returned, slightly out of breath, a small, rough wooden box in his hands. He opened it, revealing a simple silver ring, handcrafted, imperfect, the band slightly uneven where his hands had trembled as he shaped it. Cassidy's breath caught. I'm not good at speeches, Evan said, his voice thick. And I don't have a fancy ring or a fancy life to offer you. He took her hand in his, the ring resting in his palm. But I can promise you this, he said, a home, a heart that won't run, someone who'll see you, all of you, every single day, and still choose you. Cassidy's eyes filled with tears. And it won't matter, Evan continued, if we have $10 or 10 million, because the only thing I want, the only thing that matters, is you. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Cassidy laughed through her tears, a soft, choked sound of pure joy. You're an idiot, she whispered, cupping his face in her hands. Evan smiled. Maybe, but I'm your idiot, if you'll have me. Cassidy didn't hesitate. She slid the imperfect ring onto her finger, where it fit just right. Always, she said. Rusty barked approvingly from where he was busy terrorizing a flock of birds. They laughed, holding each other close as the city buzzed around them. Indifferent. It didn't matter. They had found something money could never buy, something no fortune could secure. Love. Real, messy, stubborn love. And for the first time in a long, long while, they both knew, deep in their bones, that they were exactly where they were meant to be, together. The cabin looked different when they returned. Maybe it was the season, with winter melting into spring, the yard slowly waking under the shy warmth of the sun. Or maybe it was simply that Evan Walker no longer walked into it alone. Cassidy stood on the front porch, her bag slung casually over one shoulder, Rusty circling excitedly at her feet. She tipped her head back, smiling at the wide Colorado sky. It smells like hope, she said softly. Evan chuckled, stepping up beside her. Smells like pine and old wood to me. Cassidy bumped her shoulder against his. Same thing. They spent the first days putting the house to rights together, dusting out the corners Evan had neglected, opening windows to let in the fresh mountain air. Evan built Cassidy a small bookshelf in the living room, and she filled it with a few battered novels and a leather-bound journal she always carried but rarely wrote in. Slowly, stitch by careful stitch, they wove a new kind of life together. Mornings began with coffee on the porch, watching mist burn off the hills. Days were spent in the workshop, Cassidy learning more about woodworking, Evan marveling at her stubborn patience and surprising eye for detail. Evenings were for cooking simple meals, for slow dances in the kitchen to music playing from a scratched old radio, for quiet conversations that stretched long into the night. There were still moments of fear, still days when old ghosts stirred. Evan would catch himself expecting loss to come knocking. Cassidy would hesitate before accepting the ease of her happiness. But each time, they chose to stay. Each time, they chose each other. In early spring, Evan surprised Cassidy with a clearing he'd found a few miles down the old logging trail, a wide open meadow bursting with wildflowers just starting to bloom. They spent an afternoon there, Rusty chasing butterflies, Cassidy sprawled on a blanket with sunlight catching in her hair. Evan watched her, feeling something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace. You ever think, Cassidy said lazily, plucking a daisy from the grass, about building something bigger? Evan raised an eyebrow. Bigger how? She rolled onto her stomach, propping her chin in her hands. Like a home, a real home, Not just for us. Maybe someday, for more. Her voice was shy around the edges, as if afraid to hope too much. Evan leaned back on his elbows, considering the idea. He thought about a house filled with laughter, about muddy boots on the porch and tiny handprints on clean windows, about holidays spent around a table he would build with his own two hands. He thought about Cassidy and how easily he could see her in all of it. "I think," he said slowly, "that sounds like the best kind of crazy." Cassidy beamed, her smile wide and unguarded, and Evan knew, in that moment, more surely than he had ever known anything, that home wasn't four walls or a roof. Home was a feeling, a promise, a choice, and he had already made his. That summer, Evan and Cassidy opened a small shop in town, Walker and Lane Woodworks, a place where they sold handmade furniture, repaired old motorcycles, and hosted weekend workshops, teaching local kids how to build birdhouses and simple toys. The townsfolk, initially cautious after learning Cassidy's last name, soon realized that money hadn't changed her. She showed up early, stayed late, laughed easily, and treated everyone like an equal, because she truly saw them as equals. Hope Ridge embraced her the way Evan always knew they would. Life wasn't perfect. There were late nights spent fixing leaky pipes and slow days where the shop barely broke even. There were disagreements over silly things like how much cinnamon belonged in apple pie and whose turn it was to sweep the sawdust off the floor. But through it all, there was laughter. There was love. There was a home. One evening, just as the first leaves of fall began to turn, Evan and Cassidy sat together on the front steps of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of fire and gold. Rusty dozed between them, snoring softly. Cassidy leaned her head against Evan's shoulder, sighing in contentment. "You know," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for the longest time, I thought I had to keep moving to find happiness. Like maybe it was waiting for me somewhere down the next road." Evan turned his head, pressing a kiss to her hair. "And now?" Cassidy smiled, her fingers tangling with his. "Now I know," she said, "that happiness isn't something you find." She looked up at him, eyes shining. "It's something you build." Evan tightened his arm around her, feeling the truth of her words settle deep into his bones. They had built something here, not just a life or a business or even a future. They had built a home, one that money couldn't buy, fate couldn't grant, and time couldn't take away. A home stitched together with laughter and forgiveness, patience and trust, late-night promises and early morning coffee. A home called love. And as the stars began to appear, one by one in the vast indigo sky, Evan Walker closed his eyes and silently gave thanks. For second chances, for broken roads that still led somewhere good, and for the woman beside him who had taught him that sometimes the greatest miracles begin with nothing more than a little kindness, a little courage, and the stubborn, beautiful choice to stay. Always. Before we say goodbye, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? It's always such a joy to know how far these stories travel and to feel the warmth of our growing community around the world. If you enjoyed this story and would love to hear more heartfelt journeys like Evan and Cassidy's, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world and helps keep these stories alive. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. Until next time, take care, keep believing in kindness, and never forget that love often finds us when we least expect it.